Thank you very much. Now, as we're going to kick off immediately, and as Adam Smith talks about in book 2, which is considered one of his most complicated and complex books out of his entire oeuvre, and he talks about the need for critical reflection and thinking to bind together disjointed objects to bring about order. And I think the finance sector really needs to engage in that critical thinking to think about how we're going to address climate change. So to start off, I really wanted to turn first to you, Sebastian, and I wanted to hear a bit more about NatWest and how you've been working through those kind of current strategies surrounding working through climate challenges with yourself and your stakeholders.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so we have climate as part of our purpose. We think that this is clearly a societal challenge and a defining one for many of us, and that we are uniquely placed to help the UK and the millions of customers on that transition to net zero by halving the emissions of our customers' activity between now and 2030. And a lot of the work that's gone into understanding what that means and how we can help has focused on bringing back some of those aspects that David talked about understanding the impact of business as usual on the stocks of natural capital, in particular on the stock of the climate, and the consequences of mitigated actions to that. Where I think we're looking for solutions really starts with our customers being able to, in an intensely practical way, footprint what they're doing, what their impact is, where those reliances are. And once you have that grounding and a reasonably strong expectation of where either government policy or prices or investors' preferences or even just your own as a moral sentiment, moral being, a view of what should be done, then we can lay in chain the kind of tools in order to make real action happen on the ground. So that's the intensely sort of practical approach that we've taken to helping our customers move towards that status.
And Jeremy, I wonder if you could talk a bit more generally about how we might be working on those strategies to mitigate towards climate-related risks.
Yeah, so something that we do within Aberdeen is we spend a lot of time on building what you might call plausible scenarios of the future, right? So different climate pathways, how policies across countries and sectors, they vary in different circumstances, and then what does that mean for asset prices? And then when you have a deep understanding of what those future pathways might look like, well, then you're in a much stronger position to sort of to analyse, well, how are you going to allocate or reallocate capital along a chosen pathway, or how are you going to build solutions that meet different asset owners' requirements? So I'll give an example because I think it relates to one of David's points, right? So David's exactly right that asset managers we're stewards of capital, right? There's not a cent or a pence, p, whatever, so I'm Australian, so I'm going to say cent. Not a cent of that money, right, do we own ourselves, right? It's all money that we manage on behalf of other people. However, different asset owners have radically different expectations of how we will act as stewards of that money, right? It's definitely not the case that asset owners are all beating down our door saying, please demonstrate how we can get onto a 1.5 degree pathway. There's a subset of asset owners for that is true, and then we work with them, partner with them, this is how you can do it. But then others will come to us and they'll say, I want to maximise my return over such and such a time frame, and actually I'm operating in a country, a jurisdiction that is not just not on a 1.5 degree pathway, it's not even on a 2 degree pathway, so I need you to take that into account. So one of the big complexities when you're a global asset manager is how do you take all that diversity right? So that, again, those people whose money it is and what they want from us, and how do we put this all into the mix so that we can sort of both contribute to the energy transition, but also meet the demands that we have from our clients.
Yeah, and I guess when you were talking there, I was thinking about, Adam Smith talks about, well, underlying the whole of the wealth of nations is the idea of mutual interdependencies, isn't it? Where, you know, we rely on each other for this kind of mutual flow of capital. And I guess this speaks to the idea of just transition, where you mentioned, you know, there's some individuals for which this is a really front and centre point. There's others that view economic viability in perhaps more traditional terms. So thinking about this, you know, in light of this idea of a just transition and a recognition that we are all mutually interdependent and also disproportionately disadvantaged through the effects of climate change, how do we create a balance between that recognition whilst maintaining what might be seen by some as an economically viable approach? What would you say, Seb?
So I think a big advantage of being able to get these factors into mainstream kind of macroeconomics more effectively is to be able to sort of push aside some of the kind of naive counterfactuals that you might use for policy making, where you were able to carry on producing GDP at the same rate you were. Meanwhile, you know, man is sort of separate from nature, and we have continuing degradation with those sort of, you know, no plausible impact on the system. And I think that is the. I'm not going to attempt to try and solve the political economy point, but I think that will be helpful for the reframing of the costs of climate action if we are benchmarking it again, not against a naive counterfactual, instead against something which is much more plausible. That's an incredibly complex task, and it's you know, lots of those answers are going to be unknowable and incorporate extraordinarily large ranges of outcomes when you're doing that detailed scenario work because of the complexities and the interdependencies. But I think it has a hugely important role in playing in helping reframe that debate. And therefore, if we have a better starting point of the evidence for policy making, when we're talking about the relative impacts on different people and institutions and stakeholders, then surely we're in a better starting place to rearrange how to make that work for everyone according to whatever political lens you then want to apply it. So I think fixing those informational fundamentals is a really important part of that.
Yeah. Would you agree, Jeremy?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree that information is important, but I don't think it's going to get you very close to solving the problem, unfortunately, right? So it's been well known for 20 years that the cost of the energy transition to the economy, even in narrow terms, is not actually especially high at all. And that's even when you apply traditional discount rates to future economic activity, right? Once you reinterpret that lens, it's very clear over the very long term that this would be additive. That's not actually the problem, right? The problem is a political economy problem, and it's multidimensional, right? So let me use an analogy, right? Why is the consensus around globalization breaking down, right? Part of the reason why the consensus around globalization is breaking down is because the beneficiaries of globalization are diffuse, right? And the communities, the individuals that can be harmed by those structural adjustments, they're concentrated and have not been adequately compensated for the costs of those policies. Well, there's a very close analogy when it comes to climate policy. So again, I'm Australian. Right? So why has Australia struggled so much to develop a coherent climate policy? Well, it's because many of the jobs that are tied up in the fossil fuel industry in Australia are located in very sensitive political communities, right? And so there's a short-term political incentive to effectively address policy at that group. Now, a more sensible policy might be to say, actually, we really recognise that you're going to be at the fulcrum of this adjustment, so how can we make sure that, say, revenue from a carbon tax is recycled so that that can sort of aid sort of structural change in your communities so that you're not disadvantaged, but that hasn't happened. And then you take that extra step, that's even just within a country, right? But how many politicians are incentivized to properly take into account the consequences of their actions for people that don't vote for them, right? So we're talking about the global north and the global south. Take the UK's aid budget. The UK has been cutting its aid budget, right? right, which wasn't even that high to begin with, and how many people are marching the streets, right, to sort of how many people's votes are going to change in the next general election because of that. It's too small, right? And so that is a chronic problem, because that, say that 100 billion that was cited before, right, that's a drop in the ocean in terms of what is necessary. That number was always insufficient to aid the energy transition in the global south and cope with the adaptation that is necessary just for the climate change that we can't avoid from here. But until mainstream political attitudes change about what is the legitimate concern of a voting population, then we're going to be sort of stuck talking about this problem for decades. So that's not a very positive sort of, I realise, but there's an enormous credibility gap and it's not closing at the moment.
I mean, I think, you know, to kind of return to what Seb was saying about those kind of attitudes, because one of the key aspects that you mentioned right at the beginning was NatWest's role, you know, not just as an organisation with significant capital, but also is working with key stakeholders. Do you see a kind of slightly more optimistic or proactive role that financial institutions might take?
I think there is one, in the sense of there is a broadening of decision makers' breadth of account of which they're taking into account different stakeholders already, right the way across the economy, and I think probably especially in finance. And it's, you know, time will tell, but I think that applies to groups of asset owners as well. I think to the broader constituency to which people in those positions are trying to do the best job for, then you have the best possible ingredients to make progress. I don't dismiss the concerns that Jeremy sets out for a moment. I'm just not confident that we're going to have a big bang moment where we ever overcome that. And therefore, I feel like we have to, you know, it's a bit like going back to the carbon pricing, right? Ask an economist how to do an allocation problem and they'll come back to you with some sort of pricing answer. If that's not the first, if that first best outcome isn't available, then we have to use all sorts of other tricks in the armoury in order to achieve good progress. And right now, with the scale of the emergency and the amount of work that has to be done between now and 2030 in a relatively short period of time, I think it's the framing of the race to zero and getting everyone to ratchet up that layer of ambition. It applies to countries. It can probably be applied to all sorts of different stakeholders in this process as well, rather than waiting for that big bang agreement which fixes everything in one go.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, of course.
Right. Be very clear to the audience, there is no race to net zero happening at the moment, right? It's a race that there's a very small number, right, of stakeholders in, and a very large number who are effectively in a race to something completely different in terms of their actual concrete behaviour, right? So I'm going to lay it out very starkly. Right? So in the 3 months between when sort of COVID sort of shut the global economy down in 2020, you know, to when the reopening sort of began, and global emissions declined by 6%, right, in that window, right? That 6% was smaller than the annual rate of emissions reduction that is necessary every year for the next 30 years, right, to be consistent with the net zero 2050 pathway, right? So this gap it's not a small gap, right? And then those emissions have now rebounded by 5% already. They're continuing to rise. By 2023, they'll be above 2019 levels, right? So this is the part of what concerns me. It's very easy, in fact, it can sound great to be here, talk optimistically, but if you look at the concrete actions of whether it be the corporations, the governments, people in our industry, everybody that contributes is part of this problem, the scale of the action is completely inadequate. And yes, it's true that trying to wait for a efficient carbon pricing global emissions trading scheme, that's unlikely to occur. But if the externality is not internalised, if it's not incentivised, financial flows will not align with that pathway right? The self-interest, or maybe the way to put it in David's parlance, the ethical obligation that individual institutions have in our industry or in the corporate environment. Not enough of them will change behaviour unless forced and incentivised to do so. And so that is why we're on a pathway which is more likely, which will very likely blow through 2 degrees.
And this could be a rabbit warren, in which case stop me. But I think one of the interesting roles that finance can play here is in transmitting the information to help shift aspects of that, because the point at which our customers get most excited about the opportunities to reduce their carbon footprints is the point at which they understand how rapidly, total range of speed, how rapidly their customers are becoming. It is becoming a function, an item in the function of their customers' decisions about who to work with, and that's very different for different sectors, different segments of individual markets. But a lot of the problem that customers face day to day on living their lives and interacting with the economy is just not knowing whether item A or product B is better or worse for them, better or worse for their preferences for the environment, and therefore they're not in a position to respond to any signals. And I think because of the role that finance plays touching all parts of the economy, we can help through informational tools to help get that measurement going right the way to the customer. So in the same way that food labelling works, in the same way that you check what your current account balance is on your app, we are testing tools to help you be able to have that same information about your environmental impact. Not a finished job, but I think that progress towards that path could be really constructive to help make this much more of a customer conversation for so many businesses.
So I wanted to pick up on kind of mix that behavioural change piece with ideas that you mentioned, Jeremy, about the instruments that are being put in place. So the emissions trading system, carbon tax, and so on and so forth. I mean, are these radicalising the system, or is there a piece of work that has to be done before they're going to have a positive impact?
So you're asking before those policies would have an impact. I think if those policies were introduced, they would have a radical impact on emissions pathways as long as the pricing that underpinned them was consistent with that pathway. I think maybe the more interesting question, again, in the world that, there's that concept in economics which is the world of the second best, right? So the world of the first best might be carbon pricing, emissions trading schemes. We're in the world of the second best. So what are some of the other things, the other types of policies? Well, emission standards are an example of that, right? So if you think about, so you can impose emission standards on the automotive sector, and if you make them stringent enough, they can sort of force very significant sort of change in the nature of the vehicles that are designed. And actually what they do is, again, there's this concept in economics called a shadow carbon price, right? So you can have formal carbon pricing, but the shadow carbon price is the de facto carbon price, but it's effectively disguised within the command and control policy that you're putting in place. So there's lots of options to go down that pathway, right, where you can sort of regulate instead of formally price. They're often less efficient, but because they disguise the cost, sometimes they're more politically feasible than other types of options. There are probably some opportunities to take more advantage of behavioural finance and things like those sort of concepts of nudging people in the direction of making better decisions. But again, it's the responsibility for the dilemma we're in isn't going to be really solved by individuals, at least not collectively on the scale that is necessary. The reason why carbon prices are usually levied on large emitters is because that's the most efficient place to levy it. And you don't want to, the responsibility, again, you're talking about just transitions, the responsibility for managing those consequences, I think, has to be levied on those that are responsible for generating the problem in the first place.
I think there's a lot that can be done on expectations. So take the really obvious kind of EV transition in auto. As far as my understanding of it goes, there's no one country which the global auto manufacturing industry decided, which told the global auto manufacturing industry that they had to invest for zero emission vehicles. The global auto industry has read the runes, understood the trajectory of where policies are ultimately going to go, and to quite a large degree are probably going to be running at the pace of pretty much the most ambitious so far rules that are written down and coded. So I think you can do a lot through simply creating enough certainty is the wrong word, through creating enough pokes in the right direction, even without it being priced or codified. Now, maybe that's a special case because we're talking about actually a really handful of kind of firms globally. That's going to be difficult to repeat that trick for something that's totally distributed like agriculture, but vitally important. But I think it's a good example of how the people running those firms, I presumably think they're acting in the best interests of their shareholders in a financial sense, but probably also with a nod to a few other stakeholders as well.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's right. They've been nudged in that direction. The transportation sector is becoming less carbon intensive. We shouldn't be under any illusion that the transportation sector, though, is on a net zero 2050 pathway, right? So this is part of the balance here. I sound very negative in this conversation. That's my personality. Apologies for it. I have a very strong BS filter, and in the COP meetings, there's been a lot of it, unfortunately, and it's upsetting. But it's, there is an energy transition taking place. It's a very significant one, right? For example, last year, if you look at the increase in the share of wind and solar sort of usage in the power sector, it was very significant. And it has been for 10 years. The relative price of solar PV has been dropping over the last 10 years at a much faster rate than anybody forecast. There are big changes occurring. It's just we have to be super careful about confusing that with the ultimate goal, right, which, as I say, is that 1.5 degrees or failing that below 2 degrees, because it's that gap. You can both have an energy transition and still fall short of what is necessary. So it's that wedge that I'm interested in how we can close.
I wanted to now shift gears slightly and talk a bit about natural capital, because David introduced the concept, and I guess what we read about in book 2 of Adam Smith is quite a particular view of nature that is encased in the histories in, and I guess that's very different to our post-romantic 19th century view of nature. So Adam Smith thinks about nature as being innate, being there, being plentiful, and being assumed. And of course, as David mentioned, we simply aren't in that state or in that luxury. But to what extent, when we think about natural capital as a different flavour of capital, are we really set up to make seismic changes or even start to measure what natural capital means or is within the economy?
So I think it's hugely challenging. And there are a growing number of approaches, but they taking different views of how to ascribe largely still monetary value to it. So either its role in enabling a production process like fertilization, or of pollinators, for example, or through sort of equally anthropocentric but like recreational value of capital existing. I see it more as I'm skeptical about our ability to ever really properly integrate that into the rest of the kind of the model, if you like, of how everything turns out to produce human welfare. I think instead maybe it might be more constructive to think about what well-being we are trying to promote for the people of the countries that we're serving, and approach the problem that way, because that would allow you to take into account yes, the kind of material goods and services side, fine, that's tricky, but largely done. Yes, nature, but also a whole host of other social and environmental factors, which, brilliant that nature is getting as much profile as it is, but we also want to live in communities that are thriving and provide all sorts of other opportunities for people as well. So that feels like the lens that I would go for.
I'm going to sound a bit more optimistic for a change. Oh, isn't that crazy? I presume there are a bunch of economists in this audience. I don't know whether that's true or not, that people have sort of got a business lens, but hopefully people realise that we have systems of national accounts and ways of trying to measure the capital stock that's in existence in different economies and globally. Increasingly, those measures of the capital stock have become more sophisticated over time. So, for example, they used to be primarily built on physical capital, right? Things that, you sort of, David, you spoke about it, right? Sort of Adam Smith sort of favoured the things that we can sort of tangibly produce, but actually in the modern world is actually largely the growth coming through intangible growth, and we've become much better at that, of integrating that into measuring in GDP and national accounts. Actually, in growth accounting frameworks, we also have to measure human capital, right? I mean, again, sort of labour, but human capital is sort of critical. And I don't think conceptually there's any reason why a system of national accounts, right, or capital accounts, financial flows, can't at least begin what would be a very complex, I don't want to sort of give the impression that you can sort of do this in a short period of time, but start beginning a project of properly evaluating or valuing that natural capital stock. Because I absolutely agree with that sort of that statement in the lecture, that it is essential. But if you don't try to value it, if you can't put a price on it, often it'll end up being undervalued. Right? And so if we can measure that, then you have a way of then sort of integrating this system, right, integrating the analysis, and I think you then sort of stand a better chance of being able to develop sort of tools that confront, well, okay, so this is how we value that, and that activity can be understood as running down that natural capital in that particular way, then you can sort of do welfare analysis. And that is within the gifts of governance, right? There's no reason why you couldn't sort of task statistical agencies, right, or a sort of a broader group of experts, and you would need a very broad group of estimates to start down that sort of process. So yeah, I would like to see that.
Okay. I'm very aware of time, but I wanted to turn to something that we've touched upon as we went along in terms of the role of government and dare I say regulation. And I guess Adam Smith's view, as we hear about in book 2, is not the kind of the pop fiction account of Adam Smith as having completely unregulated markets. In fact, he actually talks about the need for an infrastructure that works alongside and with the economy and keeps up with economic growth and various trends. Do you think that we're currently keeping up with economic trends in terms of working towards climate change, or does there have to be those kind of more top-down interventions in order to work on that path towards 2050?
I think we need an enormous amount of top-down interventions. We need everything. Most answers to climate is not A or B; it's the whole alphabet. And so, yeah, I think there's great scope for interventions across the whole swathe of the economy. I think it would be nice to get the price signals slightly less out of line than they are now. I think that would do a world of good. It strikes me that there is scope to do that, whilst looking after those who would be most acutely hit from a welfare perspective of any of those changes. So yeah, I think that would be hugely welcome.
Yeah, climate change is arguably the largest market failure in history, right? That's the way I would think about it. And market failure, I mean, for decades there's been an articulation within economics of how you address market failures, and it is through sensible regulation that say forces the internalization of the externality. That's not only through carbon pricing. There are a whole bunch of other things that can be done that are complementary to it. But as I say, the economy on its own, in the presence of those market failures, will not solve for the problem. And so it needs intervention. There's no doubt about it. And then on top of that, right, and this is why it's such complex, it's also an example of the tragedy of the commons sort of writ large, which is, right, let's say that the United Kingdom, right, and Scotland, right, got its whole act together, and actually the UK, if you were to order countries from worst to, best to worst, it's in the top, one of the higher echelon countries, not towards the bottom. But let's say that it got itself exactly onto a credible 2050 pathway, although I would argue that the UK should be 2040, because if emerging markets aren't going to do it by 2050, you need a balance. But anyway, actually, I've lost my train of thought. What was the point I made before the emissions?
About pathways in terms of regulation and.
Yeah, I've completely lost my turn. Isn't that strange?
Let's kind of return to Adam Smith and be a bit playful, because I guess he talked about he was critical of some forms of taxing, so he mentions the idea of beer and alehouses, and he mentions that tax upon beer is an artificial security against drunkenness, which I think is an excellent quote against any kind of taxation system. But I guess to close with, I was thinking, how might we ensure that whether that's regulation or whether our attempts as a system, a financial system, don't become an artificial security against really achieving climate change? What are some of those kind of the danger points that we need to make sure that we avoid?
I think it would be the awareness of the interdependency, and that's hopefully been helpfully illustrated by the experience through the pandemic, about just how reliant on all sorts of different actors, near and far, known and unknown, we all are for going about our daily lives and our thriving. And if we can have greater awareness of that, then that would helpfully fuel more responsible decision making by everyone with the power to do it.
I remembered my point.
Oh.
It was about the international dimension of it, right? Okay. It doesn't matter if the UK aligns, right? If the planet doesn't care where the emissions come from. In fact, people in this audience probably know UK consumption emissions are much higher than its production emissions. The system of accounting is primarily built on measuring production emissions, right? But effectively the UK deindustrialized and shipped off a lot of its emissions into poorer countries, right? And so, that collective action problem has to be solved as well. But to your point, I think something we haven't talked about here tonight at all really much is adaptation, right? Sometimes because the language of net zero 2050, whether it be the finance sector, government, it infuses everything, which is, that's the ultimate objective. But we can't lose sight of the fact that even let's say we sort of limited climate change to 1.5 degrees, well, that's still an extra 0.4 degrees beyond where we are now, right? It's plausible that there are tipping points associated even with that increase. But if we were into a 2.1, 2.2 degree world, actually most of the capital that's going to need to be deployed over the next 30 years, 40 years, 50 years isn't the energy transition, it's actually adaptation to the radical changes in the climate that are almost sort of certain to occur and will affect many of the poorest people in the world, right? Particularly sort of in like Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, sort of the Asia Pacific and the islands in particular. And, we're talking about sort of finance gaps, right? And there is a big finance gap sort of through that net zero alliance still. But there's an even larger one when it comes to how we're going to sort of adapt to it. Because again, very easy for me to sit in the audience talking about adaptation because I can pay my way to adaptation. But more than 1 billion people will not be able to do so. And so I think that is the, in a sense, the moral challenge that is sometimes forgotten here and needs to be absorbed.
Fantastic. Jeremy, Sebastian, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.